Hey, what's going on, everybody? My name is Nick. Welcome back to our Let's Read of The Sympathizer. Today we're going to be going through Chapter 6. Pretty similar structure to the way we've been doing things with this Let's Read. We'll go through a broad stroke summary of the chapter, a bit more of a play-by-play, and then do a little bit of a deep dive on one of my favorite scenes. Chapter 6, I think, is kind of climactic in a way. The whole first act of the book, I want to say, is kind of exclamation pointed with the actual assassination of the Major, which happens in this chapter. So I think that this chapter is incredibly important for not only the first kind of fourth of the book, the first quarter of the book in terms of its climax, but I think it also is going to be vastly important for the next few chapters and kind of the fallout in terms of the Sympathizer reacting to the assassination, as well as kind of the events that followed the assassination and what he chooses to do post-assassination, and kind of where his headspace is right after the events of Chapter 6. So here is my broad stroke summary of Chapter 6 of The Sympathizer. The grand opening of the General's liquor store is recounted, and the Sympathizer reunites with an old friend there. The Sympathizer has breakfast with the crapulent Major at a noodle restaurant. Professor Hammer invites Claude and the Sympathizer to a lovely dinner party, and the crapulent Major meets his end. So, like I said before, this one is really kind of a climax for this first segment of the book, this first act of the book. I think a lot of the last couple of chapters have been leading up to this. When we first learn of the Sympathizer being tasked with killing the Major in, I think it's chapter 4, if not the end of chapter 3. So this has kind of been a long time coming, the events of this chapter. So I think that this one is really important. I think there's a lot of really great juxtaposition in this chapter as well between the Sympathizer and the Major, their relationship, and kind of how it all comes to an end. So without further ado, we got kind of a lot to talk about in this chapter, so here is my play-by-play for Chapter 6. So the chapter starts with the Sympathizer attending the grand opening ceremony of the General's liquor store, and he is met by the former officers in the General's army. They're dressed in ill-fitting suits and bargain bin shoes, which highlights to the Sympathizer, after a year of living in exile, that they are well and truly defeated. Conversely, the Sympathizer meanders through the crowd in his tailored hand-me-downs from his friend, Professor Hammer. The symbolism of the well-dressed Sympathizer in the ranks of the poorly fitted retired officers of the Republican Army is fairly obvious here. Even though he is one of them, he's still an outsider among the downtrodden officers. I think that it's important to kind of juxtapose, like I was saying before, there's a lot of good juxtapositions in this chapter. This is one of those examples. The Sympathizer, like I said, he is one of them, but he's kind of playing a different game, and so he's, he just looks different. His experience is different, his perspective is different, so he is different. These guys are all pure blood Vietnamese Republicans, and he is a communist spy, Vietnamese French bastard, So I think that this is kind of a heavy-handed metaphor of the Sympathizer just well and truly being kind of not out of place, but a little bit different than the rest of the folks that are congratulating the General in the grand opening. The Sympathizer ruminates on the face of these men, and they're rapidly Americanizing women and children. A lot of their women are getting jobs in order to supplement their income, and their children are learning English and refusing to speak in Vietnamese, talking back, that kind of thing. Showing their grip on their families has begun to falter as their grip on their country has. This leads the Sympathizer to making plans with the crapulent Major to eat at the best Chinese restaurant in the area, something that he was doing when they were back in Vietnam as well. The reason that the Major can't move away from his current lodgings is because of his really good Chinese restaurant in the area. So yeah, this is just a premonition for later on when the Sympathizer and the Major eat breakfast. There's some really good stuff in that little segment that we'll get into when we get there. While moving to meet the general and his wife, the sympathizer realizes that the general is talking to Sun Do, or Sunny as he is affectionately called, a Vietnamese scholarship student in Orange County that majored in journalism. Born to a Mandarin father that was exiled for speaking out against French colonialism, Sunny was staunchly anti-war, going as far as to lead the anti-war faction of Vietnamese foreign students on campus. The sympathizer attended some of these meetings he held while also meeting with the pro-war gang, commenting on the difference in political tone, but otherwise being incredibly similar experiences. So I think that this is probably an important thing to note as well. The fact that both sides of the coin, by and large, are having the same types of meetings. It's just what they're talking about is different. I think that this kind of blurs the line between us and them. You know, it shows that we're kind of all a little bit more similar than we really would like to believe, especially in something as polarizing as a revolutionary war like this. Sunny greets the sympathizer by referring to him as old friend, which is an epithet that the sympathizer is not quite so sure about. The general says that Sunny is interviewing the couple for the first issue of Sunny's new newspaper. The sympathizer considers the general's relationship with journalists in Vietnam and the new way they must interact with them here in America. The sympathizer comments on how they imprison journalists for speaking too much truth to power. So I think that it's important that, you know, the general is now having to kind of buddy up to these journalists in order to paint himself in a good light, whereas before he was just exerting as much power as he could over them to kind of take their power away from them. Then Sunny and the sympathizer just have a good old-fashioned catch-up. After graduating, Sunny stayed in the States for fear of imprisonment in Vietnam for his anti-war leanings. He had been reporting for a newspaper in Orange County, but since the recent arrival of the Vietnamese refugees, he started the first newspaper in Vietnamese in an effort to tie them together with the news that binds. That's what Sunny says about the newspaper. The sympathizer and Sunny then agree to meet for coffee, and the liquor store opening concludes with the sympathizer commenting on the Vietnamese refugees being much changed in their year of exile. The sympathizer then breakfasts with the crapulent major at a noodle shop in Monterey Park. The Walt Whitman line here is really, really good. I'm just going to read that word for word. He says, "It was an earthy, quotidian scene, the kind Walt Whitman would have loved to write about. A sketch of the new America featuring hot rice porridge and fried crullers at a Monterey Park noodle shop crammed full of unrepentantly unassimilated Chinese and a few other assorted Asians." So that line, I think, is really stellar. The sympathizer then eats in a measured fashion, which is what he says, while the major gorges himself with the undisciplined enthusiasm of a man enamored with food. I think this is probably just the sympathizer, you know, trying to fall into line with the general in terms of his distaste for the larger of our race, you know. I think this whole scene is him trying to kind of justify the assassination to himself, and we'll get into that a little in a few seconds. The sympathizer ruminates on the possibilities of the major being an informant, commenting on the general bolstering the Vietnamese tendency for conspiracy with the American trait of paranoia, and that he was helpful in kind of bolstering this feeling. In this scene, I think he's really trying to convince himself of the major's guilt, because, you know, he's working towards making peace with the assassination, which he's pretty much unable to do. I think we can see from this scene and throughout the rest of the chapter, you know, he's going through a really, really deep crisis here because he's sentencing this innocent guy to death for no other reason outside of the fact that he's the actual spy. So I think that it's really weighing heavily on him, and this kind of meeting, this noodle shop episode, I think is important for the sympathizer to try and make his own peace with that, with him trying to kind of justify the killing to himself, which he's really not able to. The crapulent major, now a gas station attendant whose wife works in a sweatshop, goes on to gush about his new twins, Broccoli and Spinach. Hilarious. Absolutely fantastic names for a pair of twins. He offers the Sympathizer free gas for helping them escape Vietnam, and then comments on the fact that in this new and tough country, Vietnamese people must stick together. This again causes immense guilt for the Sympathizer, who then voices his guilt to Bon when he gets back to the house. Bon, who is ever the professional, cleaning and oiling the gun, making sure that everything is prepared for the eventual killing, rationalizes the killing by saying that the general has knowledge that the pair do not, and that it isn't murder but political assassination, and that in war innocent people are killed all the time. So Bon kind of has already made his peace with this, and the Sympathizer obviously has a different perspective than Bon, because he's the one who kind of decided that the Major was going to be the one who would be killed in order to save himself, and Bon is just a soldier who's undertaking the orders that have been given to him. So they're in different positions, obviously, and I think that the Sympathizer is trying to feel this the way that Bon does, trying to kind of distance himself from the emotions of the killing, but he's just unable to. And I think that this segment, the breakfast segment, as well as his conversation with Bon, really showcase that. There's a segment here that the Sympathizer talks about Bon wielding the 38 Special as the writer wields the pen or the painter wields the brush, with the stoic purpose of a man born to do a task. I just think that that's really stellar writing, something that kind of stuck in my mind as important, and just good writing that I wanted to kind of highlight and celebrate. Bon then goes on to discuss his feelings towards his grief over Lin and Duke, his failure to protect them, and the renewed purpose that killing the Major has inspired within him. The Sympathizer is astonished by his monologue, his candid proclamation of his feelings and emotions. It makes the Sympathizer reflect on the nature of killing in Vietnam versus America. In this segment, he talks about how killing in Vietnam is as easy as turning the page in a newspaper, whereas in America it kind of requires a little bit more finesse. The Sympathizer claims to not possess the desire or set of justifications required for killing, but because he must prove to the general that he is a man of action, 1, and that he is capable of rectifying his mistakes, 2, he resigns himself to the assassination of the general. The Sympathizer then recounts a dinner party that he attends with Claude and his friend Professor Hammer and his partner. We're going to get into this segment at the end. I thought that this segment was incredible, so we'll be doing the deep dive on that part. So we'll just kind of put a pin on that aspect of the conversation for right now. Bon and the Sympathizer then begin to prepare for the assassination. They begin tailing the Major, taking note of his routines and habits, noting the potential risks of the operation, and securing disguises and license plates for their escape. The Sympathizer reflects on an operation to secure a Viet Cong tax collector that him and the Major undertook when they were still living in Vietnam. The Sympathizer comments on his tipping Mon off to the raid, but the tax collector was still on the premises for the apprehension. After confiscating the tax collector's money and being given part of the funds, he realizes that he's unable to refuse the money, because that would kind of arouse suspicion with the Major, because the Major obviously is taking his cut, and the Sympathizer rationalizes it to himself, saying, if I don't take this money, then the Major is going to suspect something weird. So he takes the money and forfeits it to Mon in the Basilica. Mon then comments on the fact that this is the reason that the revolution will win, that the enemy is corrupt, and that we are not. The next night, on the 4th of July, Bon and the Sympathizer murder the Major. The Sympathizer hears his mother ask if he really wants to do this, but he states that it is too late. I think this is one of the first times that we get the sort of audible conscience of the Sympathizer in the form of his mother. We're going to get a little bit more of this as the book progresses, but I think that this is one of the first instances where it's very black and white that he's kind of hearing his mother asking these questions to him in order to kind of showcase his own internal struggle with a third party. After distracting the Major with a 4th of July gift, the Major is murdered with a single shot to the head from Bon's 38 Special. Bon then takes the Major's wallet to make it look like it was a robbery. They change the license plates in an alley nearby and then return home. The two sit in the living room drinking rye and discussing what will come of the next couple of days. The sympathizer tells Bond to burn the contents of the wallet, and he will dispose of the license plates and the ashes in the following days. The sympathizer is constantly confronted by the image of the bullet hole in the Major's head, his third eye leaking blood, which is what he says. The last couple sentences of this chapter are really stellar, and I just want to read those word for word just so we can kind of discuss the implications of them. So he says, "No matter whether my eyes were open or shut, I could still see it, the crapulent Major's third eye, weeping because of what it could see about me." So I think that that's important. You know, the sympathizer is feeling immense guilt over this killing, for good reason. You know, he sentenced an innocent man to die because he was trying to make his own safety more secure. So I think that, you know, the sympathizer is embarrassed, he's ashamed, he's, you know, all of these negative emotions, and for good reason, you know. So that's chapter 6. I think that the scenes in it kind of lend itself to a quick read. It's very action-packed. You know, we're in the General's liquor store, we're getting breakfast with the Major, we're at the dinner party, and then boom, the Major's assassination is taking place. You know, there's very little downtime in this chapter, which I think is really, really important because it shows the kind of rapid nature of the deterioration of the situation with the Major. You know, it goes from, you know, the sympathizer and him talking about how great his new twins are to the sympathizer actually ending this guy's life. So yeah, I mean, this chapter is really, really awesome. Like I said, my favorite scene in this chapter is the dinner party scene. So we will be getting into that part for our deep dive. For the deep dive this time, we'll be going to the dinner party at Professor Hammer's house with the sympathizer and Claude and Professor Hammer's partner Stan. I thought that this scene was really, really good. It kind of gives us a little bit more insight into the sympathizer's psychology, as well as kind of puts him in a place that he's not normally in, you know, with people he's not normally interacting with, and it kind of shows us more nuanced aspects of the sympathizer's personality. Like I said, this scene is incredibly interesting because it presents the sympathizer interacting once again with people who are not Vietnamese, who are not in the military, and in the case of Professor Hammer and his partner, who are not heterosexual. There's a line right at the beginning of the dinner party scene where he says, "Never having known a homosexual, I have been curious to see how one behaved in his natural environment, which is to say the West, as the East apparently had no homosexuals. Much to my disappointment, Professor Hammer seemed no different from anyone else, aside from his acute intelligence and impeccable taste in all things, extending to Stan and the culinary arts." So I think that that's important because the sympathizer doesn't really interact with a lot of homosexual people in the East. You know, he talks about the East not having any homosexuals and the West being a safe haven for homosexuals. So it's important that the sympathizer is interacting with kind of new people that challenge the way that he thinks about and experiences the world. So this scene starts with the sympathizer being impressed by Professor Hammer's tastes, beginning with his culinary acumen and extending to his house and library. There in the library, Hammer recalls the sympathizer's thesis on The Quiet American, which is a novel set in 1950s Vietnam written by Graham Greene, who is British. Claude mentions that he wasn't really a fan of the novel, commenting on the unreality of the female Vietnamese lead. He says, "All she does is prepare opium, read picture books, and twitter like a bird. Have you ever met a Vietnamese woman like her?" Some other stuff. And then he says, "All the ones I meet can't keep their mouths shut, in or out of bed." So I think that this is just kind of a silly dinner party quip from Claude. You know, it's good to see Claude kind of outside of the formality of his conversations with the general, and there's some stuff later on with Claude that gets a little bit more rigid as well, but this kind of stuff I think really helps to round out Claude's character and show that, you know, he is a friend to the sympathizer regardless of, you know, his political leanings or his occupation with the American embassy. Then Claude pokes fun at Professor Hammer for his former communist ideology. The sympathizer asks if he regrets his leanings, to which Hammer responds that if he were not a communist back then, he would not be the born-again American that he is today. The mistake was required to produce the believer that he is now. He comments on the defense of freedom and the muscularity that only America can provide for the defense. I think the idea of framing communist ideology as a mistake that you make when you're young is also really important to kind of confront the sympathizer with, because the sympathizer talks exclusively about how when he was growing up, when he was in his early university days, or I don't know if that's university, it might be like secondary school, I'm not sure. He talks about how Mon and another student and him had a little study group where they were reading communist literature, kind of learning communist ideologies, and more or less being indoctrinated into the communist way of thinking. So I think that it's important to show Professor Hammer as someone who's kind of graduated from this youthful communist ideology, in contrast to the sympathizer, who is also a young person, who is also a communist. Does this mean that maybe the sympathizer is also going to kind of grow out of this communist ideology? Does this mean that the sympathizer is, gonna hold on to some kind of born-again Republican sentimentality once he starts to get older? Only time will tell. But I think it's important to kind of plant the seeds now, so then we can kind of see them germinate and grow into the conflict that we get into later on in the novel. Hammer discusses the idea of teaching the best of what was thought and said, and that's what the university is for, with the sympathizer asking about those who have not learned or will not be taught. Professor Hammer considers this and responds that since the earliest conflicts, since man discovered fire, the great struggle has been civilization versus barbarism. The sympathizer ruminates on his killing of the major and whether this falls into the grand narrative. Again, the sympathizer is constantly wrestling with this question of his murdering of the major. Because in his mind, it really is a murder. He's an innocent man who he had to deflect blame onto in order to save his own skin. But that doesn't make the killing any easier, regardless of whether or not it's framed as a political assassination or whether or not Bond is telling him that innocent people die in war all the time. None of that really matters, because the sympathizer really is the one that's signing this guy's death certificate. So I think it's important that, he's constantly being reminded of this situation and constantly wrestling with his feelings about it. During his farewell cigarette on the porch with Claude, the sympathizer asks the question that has been plaguing him since the decision was passed down. What if he's innocent? He knows he's innocent. I think that that's an important thing to understand about this scene as well. The sympathizer knows that the major is innocent, but he's just trying to get other people to justify it for him. He's trying to get so many people around him telling him that this is okay and that this is the right thing to do, because he doesn't feel that it is. So he's trying to get as much external validation as he possibly can in order to justify it to himself that the killing isn't really that big of a deal, or that it is justified. Claude postulates that the major is innocent on one level and guilty on another, as we all are with the case of original sin, as an attempt to offer absolution to the sympathizer. At least that's what the sympathizer feels that it is, an attempt to offer absolution, So I think that, it's true, the sympathizer agrees that, sure, we all are guilty on some level. He recalls the tax collector episode where the crapulent major confiscates all this money and basically steals it for himself and gives the sympathizer some, obviously, but steals the lion's share for himself. So yeah, he's guilty on one level, but innocent on another. Is he a spy? Probably not. Is he guilty of sending people to die or requisitioning funds that don't really belong to him and that probably deserve to go to somewhere else? Yeah, he is guilty of that. But the sympathizer is not convinced of this because of his relationship with religion and leaves feeling no better than he felt before. He comments again about his father and about how his father preached about original sin, and this is something that was really important to the Catholics, and it's just not really something that he can kind of get behind. So not only is this a really great scene because we get to see the Sympathizer on his own without the general or the kind of military hierarchy that keeps him in his regimented slot, but we are seeing the Sympathizer interact with people that are totally new and unique. He doesn't really get to see a lot of not only people who are of the kind of literati class, the professor, but he doesn't really get to interact with any homosexuals. So I think that that's important to kind of flesh out his character, show him interacting with as many different people as possible to kind of put him into a more realistic frame. He maintains his pleasant and respectful demeanor, but he is conversational in a totally new and exciting way. He's not trying to get Professor Hammer. He's not trying to have any of those like gotcha moments, but he's genuinely curious about the way that Professor Hammer's ideology changed throughout his life, because maybe he's feeling something similar in his own life, or he's worried that he'll be feeling something similar in his own life. So he is worried about his communist ideologies, and I think that it's wildly important to put him in a room with someone who used to be a communist. Which shows to the Sympathizer that there are people who have sort of aged out of the party and become born-again Americans. It's wildly important to show the Sympathizer that, there is a life after your kind of communist, revolutionary sort of life. This segment also is important because I think it shows the Sympathizer not really being squeamish about non-traditional family structures. Typically in the East, at least for this time, based on what the Sympathizer is talking about, there aren't really many homosexuals out there. So I think that it's important to show that the Sympathizer is way more Americanized in his understanding of the non-traditional family as opposed to his other Vietnamese compatriots. He's not really weirded out by Professor Hammer and Stan. There is a segment where Stan squeezes Professor Hammer's hand kind of suggestively, but he's more weirded out by the fact that Professor Hammer is an actual person and has a body and therefore desires than the fact that he's a gay man. So I think that that's an important distinction that is made clearly in the book, as well as kind of implicitly through the kind of vocabulary that the author chooses to use in that segment. It's unique not only for a Vietnamese person at this time, but it's unique for communists at this time. The communists were not really sympathetic to the homosexual struggle at this time. And I think that this kind of shows that the Sympathizer is maybe not as good of a communist as he would like to believe that he is. All right, chapter 6. That one is done and dusted as well. I think that this chapter is really, really good. Shows a lot of different sides of the Sympathizer. It presents a lot of interesting food for thought for the Sympathizer. His interactions with Sonny, his interactions with Professor Hammer and his former communist ideologies, his killing of the Major and the kind of internal struggle that he's dealing with because of that, his mom kind of coming back and being the voice of reason in the final seconds before the assassination takes place. This chapter has so much, and I thought it was really amazing. So let me know what you thought. If you got any comments or suggestions, please let me know. If you want to see something different, I don't really know what that could mean, but hey, I'm open to suggestions. Next time we'll be getting into chapter 7, which I believe is a pretty short one, so it will be a pretty short video. But outside of that, thanks so much for watching, and I will see you on the next one.